Changes at Changi. Family members and friends of passengers can now pick them up in the arrival halls. It comes as Singapore gets ready to welcome fully vaccinated tourists from 8 more countries next week.
Malaysia is not the Malaysia of the 90s. Malaysia is now gone to the dogs.
And that's Anwar Ibrahim on the state of politics in his country. Welcome to The Big Story. I'm Olivia Quay. Changi Airport is getting ready for Singapore's biggest reopening of travel since the pandemic shut down borders last year. At the arrival halls, family members and friends will be able to pick up passengers from low-risk countries or regions. Staff were seen removing signboards which say that family and friends can only pick up passengers at the arrival pickup point. It's been 5 months since pickups were severely restricted following a COVID-19 outbreak at the airport. The easing of rules comes as tourists from 8 more countries can enter Singapore from next Tuesday, October the 19th, under the Vaccinated Travel Lane scheme. Fully vaccinated travellers from Canada, Denmark, France, Italy, the Netherlands, Spain, the UK and the US won't need to spend any time in quarantine. Professor Teo Yik Ying is back. He's the Dean of NUS's Swee Hock School of Public Health. Prof, within the first day of applications for the 8 new VTLs, at least 700 short-term visitors have been approved to enter Singapore. The number would have grown since then. So while visitors, they mean promising things for our tourism industry, should Singapore residents be concerned in any way that more VTL travellers will be coming in from next Tuesday?
I believe there may be some people in Singapore who are worried about the number of short-term visitors coming into Singapore, especially from countries where the COVID situation seems to be raging still. And opening up to so many countries at one go seemed to be completely different to the border control strategy that Singapore had since March last year, where we were very prudent and risk-averse in allowing short-term visitors in. I would emphasize that the situation now in Singapore, it's very different to the situation last year. And the reason for this difference lies in the vaccination. Singapore now has more than 85% of the population fully vaccinated against COVID. And many of the countries that we have VTL arrangements with, they similarly have vaccination rates in excess of 60%, some even more than 70%. The travel arrangement now is also centered only around fully vaccinated people. So actually, Singapore residents do not need to be overly concerned with these incoming travelers. Now, will there be a risk of leakage, meaning some of these incoming travelers may actually be infected, but not be found by the arrival test? And I think, yes, there certainly will be a few infected travelers that will slip through the testing protocol. But just as how Singapore has moved into a phase of treating COVID as endemic, actually having this few infected travelers into the country is not going to change the trajectory of COVID-19 in Singapore. And I actually should emphasize that these travelers, when they come into Singapore, they would have been tested when they arrive. And they are only allowed to move about when their tests show that it's negative. In comparison, residents like you and me in Singapore, we move about the community now without really being tested at all, except maybe for some workplace requirements. So comparatively speaking, we actually have information that at least these travelers test negative on arrival.
That's a very good point to remember, Prof. Well, other infectious diseases experts believe that border closures are somewhat unnecessary as long as the people crossing the borders are vaccinated. Where do you stand on this?
Well, I would first say that this is forward-looking of them to think this way. And I certainly expect that the world will move towards this model eventually. Very much like how the world treats yellow fever right now, when one travels to any country where yellow fever is actually endemic. But I do think that we, not just Singapore, but the world collectively, we are not there yet. And actually for very practical and operational reasons as well. So people have been wondering about how Singapore chose the countries for the VTLs, at least this current batch of VTLs. And previously, we talked about the reasons being the vaccination rate in these populations, We talk about the economic ties between Singapore and these countries, and also the fact that there are many residents in Singapore from these countries, and also how these countries play host to many Singaporeans studying there or working there. So those are the reasons that we talked about previously. But I think what many people may not have realized is also the state of the health systems in these countries in terms of the way that they're able to keep records of who have been vaccinated and how do we retrieve this vaccination record in a trusted manner such that it cannot be tampered, as well as whether when we say that a person has been vaccinated, this person indeed has been given a vaccine in a safe and trusted environment. So when it comes to airline and airport authorities, they don't have to worry about whether vaccination records for this incoming traveler is authentic or not. And I think in addition to all that, these are also the countries where the types of vaccines that are used are very similar to what Singapore uses or those that are approved under the WHO emergency use listing. We don't see strange or new vaccines that are being used by countries which we don't have prior information on. So I think these are additional factors that needs to be considered in order to operationalize a travel link arrangement. So certainly there are many other countries that will satisfy the conditions that I talk about. And I actually expect that it will be a matter of time that Singapore will announce additional VTL arrangements with these countries. But for some countries, I think this process could happen within the next few weeks, but other countries, this may actually take a much longer time because there are countries that are still ramping up their vaccination, including ways to keep tabs of who have been vaccinated or not.
Right. Well, Prof, let's turn our attention to a rather grim figure from last night when the Health Ministry reported that two youngest fatalities, they were 23 and 34 years old, and both had multiple underlying medical conditions. Well, as you know, most fatalities so far in Singapore were older people or unvaccinated people. But given these young deaths, should young people worry?
So maybe before I answer that, I would like to start off by expressing my condolences to the families of those who have passed on. And it's never easy losing someone in the family, especially even harder when family has lost someone at a young age. Coming back to the question that you have asked about whether young people should worry, I think the focus by the public and also the media right now certainly is centering around the age of these individuals, that they are young and yet they died from COVID. But I think the real focus shouldn't be on the age, but should instead be on two issues. The first issue is that both of the young fatality, regrettably, both of them are not fully vaccinated. The second issue is that both of them actually had underlying medical conditions, and one of them had multiple conditions. That was what was reported. I believe that these are actually much more important to highlight and not the age. Because for a while now, MOH, the ministers, even Prime Minister himself have encouraged people to come forward to be vaccinated. And we have tried all manners of encouragement, including some F&B outlets even offering incentives for vaccinated people. And the reason for all these efforts, it's really because vaccination makes a difference between life and death, especially when one is infected with COVID. And vaccination is even more important if a person has an underlying medical condition. And I think this is independent of how young or how old a person is. So there are still people who think it's okay, I'm young, if I'm infected, I will be all right. And so some of these people chose not to be vaccinated. And for others who are not vaccinated, they may be worried because they have some health problems and they are worried that vaccination may not be good for them and that it will make them even more ill. Now, if you're someone like that, or if you know of someone like that, my advice is speak to your family doctor or the specialist that you're seeing for your conditions. Ask them directly, can I take the vaccination or not? Seek professional medical advice. Don't make the decision on your own. In general, people who are healthy and fully vaccinated, they don't need to fear COVID-19. If you have some medical conditions, it is even more important that you are fully vaccinated. And I think this advice holds true for people of all ages and not just the young people.
Professor, thank you as always for sharing your perspective on these two matters today. I'm always happy to be joined by Professor Teo Yik Ying, Dean of the Swee Hock School of Public Health at NUS. 15 deaths in Singapore yesterday, the highest recorded in a single day and the 25th straight day that deaths were reported. 2,932 new cases were also reported yesterday, 2,412 in the community, 517 from the dorms and 3 imported. As for cases in hospital, as at yesterday, 1,511 were warded, with 310 needing oxygen support and another 46 in ICU. Meanwhile, an exception to rules about who can enter shopping malls won't be made for unvaccinated caregivers who bring children to tuition or enrichment classes. This is unlike those who bring kids to childcare centres and preschools because, according to Enterprise Singapore, childcare centres or preschools are key services typically required by parents who need to return to work, whereas unvaccinated caregivers can make alternative arrangements like having a vaccinated person take the child to the tuition or enrichment class. They can also get a valid negative pre-event test result before entering the mall. Looking overseas, from November the 1st, Sydney will allow fully vaccinated foreigners to enter quarantine-free, with New South Wales's Premier saying, "We can't live here in Hermit Kingdom, we've got to open up." 80% of the state's adult population is expected to be fully vaccinated by this weekend. Malaysia is considering opening its borders to fully vaccinated travellers from selected countries without the need for quarantine. National Recovery Council Chairman Muhyiddin Yassin says the arrangement would be based upon mutual recognition of vaccine certificates, as several countries have done. From Malaysia's handling of Covid-19 to prospects of a snap general election, opposition leader Anwar Ibrahim sat down for a wide-ranging interview with the Straits Times this week. He also spoke bluntly about the political situation right now, saying, quote, "Malaysia has gone to the dogs." He was responding to a question on how the Pakatan Harapan opposition coalition can convince Malaysians to vote in the next election, amid public frustration with politics following 3 different governments since 2018.
Why condemn the country and the ordinary people for the failure of the few? Who are those involved in absconding wealth of this country? Who enrich themselves and condone all forms of corruption and abuse of power? And why all politicians are implicated? I understand. Many of my friends, my family members are just disgusted with the way politics is being played. By whom? You see, there's a point. Our task, therefore, is to encourage them, look, the country must be saved. Malaysia is not the Malaysia of the 90s. Malaysia has now gone to the dogs. Why? Because we either tolerate or allow politicians, corrupt ones, to continue to play this game. So I think what we need is the support of the masses. What sort of image do we have internationally? Ask anyone outside this country, what do they know about Malaysia? 1 MDB. Okay. What do they know about Malaysia? Instability. Pure, plain contest for power. Without devoid of any principles or policy changes. So you have prime ministers coming in, going, but the same policies remain. How many ministers do we have now? Plus deputy ministers, plus over 70 for a small country. At the time when we are poor, when people are suffering.
That was Malaysian opposition leader Anwar Ibrahim speaking to our regional correspondent Leslie Lopez, and you can watch an extended version of the interview on straitstimes.com. In other news, IMDA has cancelled the online citizens class license after it repeatedly refused to comply with its legal obligation to declare all sources of funding. TOC's license was suspended last month and it was ordered to stop posting content on its website and social media channels. Singapore's current carbon price of $5 per tonne is too low, according to Finance Minister Lawrence Wong, and a revised tax rate will be announced in next year's budget. Speaking at an Institute of Policy Studies event, Mr. Wong says that as the government introduces higher carbon taxes, it will also enhance U-Save rebates to help lower and middle-income households with the transition. Several buildings and an entrance archway belonging to St. Teresa's home in Upper Thomson Road are being proposed for conservation by the Urban Redevelopment Authority. The structures, including a chapel, dormitory blocks and an administration building, have stood since 1937. The proposal will be open for public consultation until November 13th. Rosmah Mansoor, the wife of ex-Malaysian Prime Minister Najib Razak, is free to travel to Singapore to visit her pregnant daughter after getting her passport back. But currently on trial for graft, she must return it to the court by December the 6th. Rosmah's daughter is expected to give birth soon. And in sports, a new wave of optimism carrying Newcastle into their match with Tottenham this weekend, their first since being bought by a Saudi-backed consortium. Our sports correspondent says, though, that its financial might won't turn the squad into a good one overnight.
Yeah, it's really interesting, because I think there'll be a lot more eyes on Newcastle for this game than any other this season. And I think a lot of people will be surprised because while Newcastle might be the richest football club in the world at the moment, on paper at least they have one of the poorest squads in the league. I wrote in a column last week after the takeover that the reality is that the club is second last. It has an unimpressive squad and an underwhelming manager. And it's a rarity among Premier League clubs in a sense where you can actually make improvements to the team in every area of the pitch. Steve Bruce is likely to still be the manager for the game against Spurs, and he will not have had the time or the ability to work any magic and suddenly turn Newcastle into a very good football team. But, buoyed by the positivity in the city and the fans who are likely to turn out in numbers and make themselves heard even louder than usual, I definitely can see them beating Spurs and nicking a win. Even then, I think it's almost certain we will see a new manager in the dugout come January, and at least 2 or 3 new faces who will hopefully bring the quality that the squad desperately needs.
Well, certainly a match to look out for, especially if you're a Magpies fan. Well, those are our top stories for today. For more news and videos, visit straitstimes.com and subscribe to our YouTube channel by hitting the red button below. I'm Olivia Quay. Have a great weekend, and I'll see you soon.